In the quiet village of Lamba, where the baobab trees stood like ancient sentinels and the winds carried the scent of roasted maize, lived a girl named Ebony. She was a child of silence and softness, her presence often missed like a breeze that slips through cracks. Her mother had died when she was still too young to remember her face, leaving only one thing behind: a simple blue dress stitched by hand with tiny white threads that shimmered like stars. The dress was the only relic Ebony clung to. Her stepmother, Madame Majoke, had arrived when Ebony was 8, bringing with her a daughter named Remy, who always smelled of rose oil and never repeated the same garment twice. Remy had silk ribbons and gold bangles, while Ebony had threadbare sandals and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. Ebony wore her mother's dress only on special days: solstice prayers, the harvest moon, and her birthday, which she quietly marked by lighting a candle in the shrine behind their hut. The blue fabric wrapped her like a hug, and when she spun in it, she could almost hear her mother laughing. But joy in that house was borrowed time. One morning, a royal messenger arrived. He wore the sun on his shoulders in the form of golden epaulets and bore a scroll sealed with the king's crest. The Festival of Light, held once every 7 years, was to be the grandest the kingdom had ever seen. Every family in Lamba was invited to attend, and from among the villagers, one maiden would be chosen to present a lantern to the prince, a role of honor, tradition, and legacy. Ebony clutched the edge of the parchment when she saw it nailed to the village square. The festival was in 3 days. For the first time in her life, she dared to hope she might stand among the crowd as more than a shadow. That night, she unfolded the blue dress gently, smoothing its creases like prayer. She imagined herself glowing under the lanterns, her mother's dress floating like water around her. But Remy saw her. And Remy, whose laughter always carried an edge, didn't ask questions when she entered their shared room the next afternoon. She simply grabbed the dress from Ebony's hands. "No one wants to see a rag girl in rags," Remy sneered. Her bangles clinked like warning bells. Ebony lunged forward, grabbing the hem. But Remy was faster, stronger in her entitlement. A loud rip echoed through the room. The blue fabric tore down the side like paper. "No!" Ebony gasped, her hands trembling. Remy laughed high and sharp. "Now it matches your life, torn and useless." She tossed the ruined dress onto the floor, then turned and walked away, humming a tune about jasmine and royalty. Ebony sank to her knees. Her fingers reached for the torn cloth, gathering it like petals of a fallen flower. She tried to sew it. Thread and needle danced through her tears. But the fabric frayed more with every attempt. It was as if the dress itself had given up. That night, she walked barefoot under the moonlight to the old baobab tree at the edge of the village. It was where her mother used to take her before sickness took her away. She remembered holding her mother's hand under its branches, giggling as fireflies lit up the roots. She dug with her hands, nails breaking, palms blistering. And when the earth was soft enough, she laid the pieces of the dress inside. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wanted to make you proud." As she covered the dress with soil, a strange stillness fell over the tree. The wind paused. The leaves shivered but did not fall. A single firefly hovered above the ground and blinked once, twice, then disappeared. The next day passed like a ghost. Ebony stayed in her corner of the house, silent and unseen. Remy paraded around in a new crimson wrapper, her eyes gleaming with excitement. She would be attending the festival now in Ebony's place. Madame Majoke approved heartily, polishing Remy's shoes until they shone like glass. On the day of the festival, the village burst into color. Drums beat like thunder, dancers swirled in bright fabrics, and lanterns floated into the sky like stars returning home. Ebony remained behind, her eyes red from crying. She sat near the hearth, staring into the dying coals, when the house trembled with a sudden thump. A noise came from outside. Then another. And then heat. The floor near the doorway glowed faintly orange. Ebony stood, heart racing. She ran outside. The baobab tree was glowing. Not in flames, but with light. The ground where she'd buried the dress pulsed like a heartbeat. From the soil rose the clay urn her mother had once used to fetch water. It had not been there before. But now it stood upright, its surface glowing with gold lines that traced the shape of the dress. Steam rose from within. As Ebony stepped closer, the urn burst with a sound like thunder, and the broken pieces of the dress scattered into the air, each one glowing, spinning, reforming. She gasped as the dress began to stitch itself in midair. Piece by piece, the dress came together, not as it once was but stronger, more radiant. The blue deepened to ocean sapphire. The white threads became silver filaments. The air shimmered. When the dress fell gently over her shoulders, it felt like being cradled by her mother again. Behind her, the clay pot floated up, then dropped with a soft thud into her arms. Inside, wrapped in banana leaves, was hot herbal porridge and small cakes. The kind her mother once made for special days. Without thinking, Ebony ran. Through fields, past dancers and villagers who gasped at her appearance. Her feet did not touch the ground. At the palace gates, the guards stepped aside wordlessly. And inside the royal pavilion, as Remy bowed low with her lantern before the prince, a gust of wind swept through the room. Candles flickered. Silk curtains flew. Ebony entered. Gasps filled the air. Her dress shimmered like the ocean under moonlight. Dust clung to her feet, and yet no one looked at anything but the light surrounding her. The prince stood. And from the moment their eyes met, the story of the girl with one dress became more than a whispered sorrow, it became legend. The war had erupted like a sudden storm beyond the river Olu, with arrows blackening the sky and the clash of steel shaking the trees. The border villages screamed as raiders poured in, torching huts, tearing down banners of peace, and slaughtering without pause. Among the chaos rode Prince Jaru, the youngest commander in a century, his golden armor catching the light as he charged at the head of his battalion. He was swift, bold, and burning with the need to prove himself worthy of the throne his aging father would one day leave behind. His warriors followed him with trust, but the enemy outnumbered them and knew the terrain better. At the height of the battle, a hidden archer from the cliff above struck Jaru's arm. The arrow pierced through skin and bone, knocking him off his horse. The world spun. Pain like fire licked through his body as he tried to rise. Blood soaked his sleeve and dripped from his fingers, turning the soil beneath him red. His guards shouted his name, but the battle separated them. He was forced to crawl, dragging his body through tall grass and shadowed trees, deeper into unfamiliar land. The forest felt like a tomb, dark and heavy with silence, broken only by the prince's labored breaths. He clutched at the wound, dizzy and cold, vision blurring as the trees closed in around him. Birds fluttered above, startled by the disturbance. His once golden cape had dulled, stained by mud and blood. Jaru stumbled through the underbrush, guided by sheer will and fading hope. He didn't know where he was anymore, only that he had crossed the river and left the battlefield far behind. Each step was slower, his strength waning. Eventually his legs gave out. He fell near a thicket of bushes on the edge of a small village, Lamba, a quiet place far from the court's eyes. No one in Lamba recognized the prince. His armor was scratched and dented, hidden beneath a cloak he'd torn from a fallen enemy. His face, though noble, was gaunt with pain. When a young goat herder passed by and spotted the man crumpled by the road, he ran to get help, thinking he'd found a wounded traveler or perhaps a thief punished by the forest spirits. The villagers approached cautiously. They whispered as they carried Jaru to the healer's hut. Old women clucked their tongues at the sight of the wound. Children peered in from the windows. The healer, Mama Olanma, frowned as she worked on the wound, removing the arrowhead and washing the torn flesh. "He's lucky he didn't bleed to death in the trees," she muttered. But there was no silk to bind a prince's arm. No royal linens or embroidered cloths in Lamba's humble corners. And so, they searched for any scrap of clean fabric they could find. Among the few who gathered was a girl with wide, worried eyes and a quiet presence, Ebony. She had come not to see the stranger, but because the goat herder had mentioned his wounds, and something inside her pulled her there. She stood in the corner, clutching a clay bowl of herbs and honey, unsure if she should speak. That was when Mama Olanma asked aloud, "We need cloth, something thick enough to stop the bleeding." Ebony hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the ground. Her fingers tightened around the bowl. Then, slowly she stepped forward. "I have something," she whispered. Without waiting for approval, she turned and ran through the winding footpaths, past the mango trees and the dry well, to the great baobab tree. She dropped to her knees and began digging with her hands, tears mixing with the dirt. Bit by bit, she pulled out the scraps of her blue dress, the one torn by her stepsister and buried in grief. It was dusty, frayed, but still hers. Still whole in spirit. The fabric felt warm in her hands like it remembered joy. Like it remembered her mother's voice. Like it had waited for a purpose beyond shame. She returned with it and held it out. "Use this," she said, voice shaking. Mama Olanma blinked, surprised. "Child, are you sure?" Ebony nodded. "It's clean. It's strong. It will hold." The healer took the cloth and gently wrapped it around the prince's wound. The blue fabric darkened as it absorbed blood, but it held firm. Jaru stirred beneath the weight of exhaustion and pain, murmuring incoherent words. His hand brushed the cloth, and though he couldn't yet open his eyes, he seemed to sigh in relief. And somewhere, though no one saw, the blue threads shimmered faintly in the dim candlelight, as if recognizing the importance of the moment. As if choosing to live again, not as a dress of humiliation, but as a bandage of purpose. That night, while the village slept, the winds shifted. The war still raged across the river, but here in Lamba, destiny had quietly changed course. The prince had fallen. And the torn cloth of a forgotten girl had caught him. Ebony woke that morning with strange itch in her chest, the kind that didn't scratch away with fingers or movement. It hummed low, like the sound of bees in a hollow tree. She sat on her mat and listened. The wind carried no birdsong. The leaves outside didn't rustle playfully as usual, they shivered like they were cold or scared. The village of Lamba had long whispered about Ebony's unusual gift. As a child, she had been found speaking to roots, laying her ear to the ground, and claiming the earth talked back. Most called it nonsense. Some called it madness. Only her late mother had believed her. "Your ears are tuned to deeper music," she'd once said, brushing Ebony's hair by the baobab tree. "When others hear wind, you hear memory." Now that memory tugged at her again. Something was wrong. Leaving her chores undone, Ebony stepped out of the clay hut and walked barefoot past the goats, past the tired garden and into the forest. The further she walked, the louder the feeling became. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but a sensation, an ache that didn't belong to her. Her hands tingled. Her feet moved faster. Past the edge of the village, the air changed. The forest here was old, sacred. Trees stretched high like arms reaching to ancestors. Ebony's steps grew softer as if not to disturb whatever lived within the silence. Then, just as she stepped around a thick vine, she saw him. A man lay crumpled on the forest floor, half covered by dry leaves and tangled in thorns. His tunic was torn, stained dark with blood. One arm lay limp at his side, the other clutched to his chest, trembling slightly. His face was pale, too pale, and sweat beaded along his forehead like raindrops on stone. Ebony gasped and dropped to her knees. She didn't recognize him. His hair was matted, his clothes unlike anything worn in Lamba, but none of that mattered. Pain clung to him like fog, thick and suffocating. She leaned close and listened. Not to his words, he wasn't speaking, but to the forest around him. The trees groaned low. The roots hummed with worry. The wind carried whispers. He should not die here. Ebony gently brushed leaves from his face. His skin was hot, feverish. Infection, perhaps. He needed help. But what could she do? She had no herb strong enough for this kind of wound. No cloth to stop the bleeding. Not even her woven shawl would help. It was too coarse, too small. Then, suddenly she thought of the baobab tree. The dress. Her mother's dress. Torn. Shredded. Buried beneath the soil weeks ago when Remy had destroyed it in a jealous fit. Ebony hadn't touched it since, couldn't bear to. But now, her feet were already moving, running back toward the village edge. She reached the old tree, its wide roots like arms curled in embrace. Dropping to her knees, she dug with her hands, dirt clinging to her fingers. Within moments she felt the fabric, the worn softness of blue cotton, frayed and muddy but still whole in spirit. Piece by piece she pulled it out, pressing it to her face. It still smelled faintly of ash and baobab flowers. A tear slipped down her cheek. "Mama," she whispered. "Let it help." Back in the forest, the stranger hadn't moved. Ebony gently pressed the cleanest pieces of the dress to his wounds. She tore strips, tying them tightly around his arm. The cloth drank his blood, but it didn't reject the work. In fact, as she tied the last knot, the fevered flush on his cheek seemed to ease, just slightly. Night fell around them, but Ebony stayed. She built a small fire from dry twigs and murmured lullabies to the flames, the same ones her mother used to sing. Every so often, she wiped the stranger's brow with a cool leaf soaked in water from the nearby stream. At some point he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, confusion flickering in their depths. "Where?" he croaked, voice dry as cracked stone. "You're safe," Ebony whispered. "Rest now." He blinked at her, then at the fire, at the trees, at the strips of blue cloth wrapped around his arm. For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe? Or gratitude. But the fever pulled him back into sleep. Ebony watched over him through the night, feeding the fire and whispering to the roots. She didn't know who he was. But something inside her said he mattered. That he wasn't just a stranger who wandered into the woods to die. And when dawn painted the sky with light, she saw something else. Where the dress had touched his skin, the wound no longer bled. The torn cloth had held more than just memory, it had held strength. Her mother's love. Her own resilience. A story not finished yet. Ebony smiled faintly and whispered to the wind, "Thank you." The earth answered softly, and somewhere deep in the forest, the trees exhaled. Ebony's fingers trembled as she pressed the last strip of her mother's dress against the stranger's burning arm. The blue cloth, worn but soft, clung to his skin as though it recognized what was needed. The fever that had ravaged him for days seemed to pause, retreating just enough for his chest to rise and fall in steadier rhythm. Ebony sat back on her heels, breathless from both fear and wonder. She had only intended to stop the bleeding, to give this broken man one more night. But something in the cloth whispered of purpose, as if her mother's spirit still lingered in every thread. She had buried the torn pieces beneath the baobab tree days ago, hoping to let go of the hurt. But when she found the wounded man, with blood pooling beneath him and life flickering like a dying flame, her feet had led her straight back to that spot. The earth gave up the cloth easily, almost eagerly. And now it served again, this time not to adorn but to heal. The stranger moaned softly in the half-sleep of the fevered. Ebony sat by his side, wiping his forehead with a damp leaf. She didn't know who he was. His clothes were fine, though torn and muddied, and there was a strange ring on his finger she had never seen before, silver, carved with a lion's head. But none of it mattered. He was alone. And he was hurt. She built a fire near the hidden cave where she had carried him, feeding it carefully with dry branches. By day she foraged herbs, bitter barks and cooling roots, and crushed them with stones, mixing salves she had seen her grandmother make. By night, she sang old lullabies under her breath as she kept the fever at bay. When he finally opened his eyes on the third day, they were hazy and golden like dawn after a storm. He didn't speak, only blinked slowly and winced as he moved. Ebony helped him drink from a carved gourd of water. He sipped like a child, weak and wary, but when their eyes met, there was something deeper than thanks in his gaze. There was recognition. Not of her face but of her presence. As though the kindness she poured into every movement was something he'd long forgotten the world could offer. "You don't know me," he rasped on the fourth day. Ebony shook her head gently. "And you don't know me. So we're even." That made him smile. Just a flicker but enough. He never told her his name and she didn't ask. Instead she told him stories. As she cleaned his wounds with warm herbal poultices and changed the blue strips of cloth that bandaged his arm and shoulder, she spoke of her mother, how she would bake sweet yam cakes in the shape of stars, how her laughter used to ring through the village like bells. She told him about the Festival of Light, where lanterns floated into the sky like golden birds, and how she'd once dreamed of dancing beneath them in the only dress she had. "She tore it," Ebony murmured one night, wringing a cloth over the fire. "My stepsister. Out of jealousy. I loved that dress." The prince, though Ebony still didn't know he was a prince, looked down at the pieces wrapped around him. He moved his fingers slightly, brushing the edge of one bandage. "This?" he asked, voice gravelly. "Yes," she whispered. "That was my dress. I buried it, thinking it was useless now. But it found a new way to matter, didn't it?" He didn't answer. His eyes drifted closed, not from pain but from something more peaceful. Sleep came easier now. Healing had begun. Each morning the cloths had to be changed. And each time Ebony unwrapped them, she noticed something strange. The wounds beneath healed faster than she expected. Skin that had been torn open closed into clean lines. The fever never returned after the 6th day. Even the bruises faded like storm clouds chased by sun. She began to suspect the cloth held more than memory, it held intention. Her intention. Her love. Her refusal to let pain be the last thing the fabric ever touched. One afternoon he sat up on his own. Ebony brought him wild fruit mash and he ate without help. His cheeks, once hollow, had filled in again. When he reached to hand her the empty bowl, his fingers brushed hers. "You saved me," he said. "I patched what I could," she replied, sitting cross-legged across from him. "But it was the cloth that did the rest." He studied the faded blue fabric around his arm, and for the first time she saw something like awe in his eyes. "Then I've never worn anything more sacred," he murmured. They both fell silent, listening to the wind pass through the trees. As the days passed he grew stronger. He began to help with the fire, to carry water from the stream, and to hum with her as she worked. But neither of them mentioned what came next. She still didn't know who he truly was. And he seemed content not to be known. Still, the blue cloth remained on him, cleaned, dried, and returned each day like a prayer. It wasn't just cloth anymore. It was story. It was witness. It was the bond between a girl who had nothing and a man who'd nearly lost everything. And neither of them would ever see it the same way again. In the village of Lamba, when someone disappears, mouths begin to move faster than feet. The day Ebony vanished, carrying only a water pot and a piece of bread, Remy wasted no time before crafting a tale so poisonous that even the trees winced. She ran off, Remy declared loudly in the marketplace, with some foreign man. A soldier maybe. Or worse, a wandering thief. Her voice cracked just enough to seem like grief, but her eyes gleamed like someone who had thrown a stone and was waiting to see which window it shattered. The villagers, most of whom never paid Ebony any kindness to begin with, took the story and let it grow roots. I always thought she looked at men strangely, muttered one woman who'd never once greeted Ebony kindly. And the way she whispered to trees, probably witchcraft, added another. Like dry leaves catching fire, the gossip spread, curling around every ear, twisting truth into ash. The stepmother, Adeola, stood outside their mud-brick home wearing a faded wrapper and a look of practiced sorrow. She dabbed her eyes with the edge of her scarf whenever someone passed, murmuring, "My poor Ebony, led astray." But when the doors closed and the sky dimmed, she leaned back against the wall and sighed, not in grief but in quiet relief. Ebony was gone. No more competition. No more questions from the village elders about why the girl always looked tired or why she was never seen in fine clothes. Remy, on the other hand, blossomed in the shadow of the lie she had spun. She began wearing brighter colors, louder jewelry, and painting her eyelids with crushed berries. She walked through the village square like a swan among ducks, tossing her braided hair back with every step. If the prince ever came to Lamba, she'd say loudly near the well where girls gathered, he'd have chosen me. Not some dirty orphan with one ragged dress. She had no idea how close that truth came. By then Prince Jaru's absence had rippled through the kingdom. Posters bearing his face began to appear in the surrounding towns, inked by worried palace artists who painted him with golden eyes and firm features. Rewards were promised. Search parties were dispatched. Rumors bloomed everywhere. Some said he'd been taken by rebels, others whispered that he'd eloped with a village girl from across the river. Remy's ears perked up when one traveler mentioned that the prince might have passed through the lowlands near Lamba. That evening, under candlelight, she ran her hands over her softest wrapper and whispered to her reflection, "A prince would see me and forget all others." She begged her mother to let her travel to the capital for the moon market, where nobles and merchants would gather. "It's the perfect time," she insisted. "If I'm to find a suitor of worth, I must be seen among the highborn. Even the prince might be there, wounded, yes, but still choosing his bride." Adeola hesitated. Travel was expensive and they had little. But Remy had inherited more than cruelty, she had her father's silver tongue. "What if I return with a husband who takes us into wealth? What if I'm chosen for palace service?" She dropped her voice. "Ebony isn't coming back. This is our chance." So the stepmother sold a goat, one of the last animals they had. With the coins, Remy bought a gown stitched by the widow Olamide, paid for a ride with a spice merchant, and left for the capital with fire in her eyes. But fate, ever mischievous, was not done twisting threads. Because even as Remy adjusted her bracelets and prepared her lies for courtly ears, Ebony was deep in the forest, still tending to the prince. And though he didn't yet reveal his identity, he listened when she spoke of how her stepsister tore her dress, of how shame could be sewn into silence, and of how kindness was not weakness but strength woven gently. And the cloth, those torn, faded scraps now wrapped around his healing arm, held a story of their own. A story no lie could erase. A story the trees remembered. A story that would, in time, undo all the falsehoods spun in the village of Lamba. But for now, Remy sat proud in her coach, dreaming of thrones and jewels, unaware that truth had already begun its slow, steady walk back home. The prince's return to the palace stirred the entire kingdom. Trumpets sang from the watchtowers as villagers lined the roads, their cheers rising like a tide. Yet within Jaru's heart, a quiet ache pulsed, a longing shaped by the gentle voice and steady hands of the girl who had nursed him with shreds of her only dress. He wore the final piece beneath his armor, pressed to his chest like a second heartbeat, its faded blue edge brushing his skin as a silent reminder. Back in the woods of Lamba, Ebony watched the birds fly east and whispered her farewell to the wind, trusting it would reach him. She resumed her life in silence, watering the baobab tree, cooking for her thankless family, and offering help to anyone in need. The villagers whispered about her disappearance and return, but she paid them no mind. At court, Jaru gave no name when asked who had saved him. He said only, "A spirit of the forest tended my wounds." Nobles wove tales of dryads and healer witches, but none could imagine the orphan girl with soil-stained fingers and eyes that heard the earth. Yet Jaru held her memory close, a fire wrapped in silk. On quiet nights, he would walk alone in the palace gardens and place his hand over his armor, feeling the dress fragment beneath. "You chose the roots over the crown," he would whisper, "but I will not forget." The kingdom rejoiced at his safe return, but the prince's heart remained in a village that had never known its treasure. And far away, under the ancient baobab, blue flowers bloomed for the first time in years. The royal city was transformed into a cascade of colors and sounds for the festival of reckoning. Banners fluttered from tall spires, drums echoed through cobblestone streets, and the scent of roasted meats and honey cakes thickened the air. It was a celebration of peace, of battles survived, of wounds mended, of kingdoms stitched together again. The queen herself had declared it open to all, nobles and commoners alike, and from every corner of the land, travelers made their way to witness the spectacle. From Lamba too the villagers made their journey. Remy and her mother arrived early, their donkey cart loaded with embroidered silks and scented oils. Remy wore a gold-colored gown that shimmered like water under the sun, and her hair was adorned with beads that clinked like coins. She walked with her chin high, convinced the capital would see her for the jewel she believed herself to be. Her mother clung to her side, whispering reminders to smile sweetly, speak softly, and bow low. They had a plan: to mingle among the nobles, charm their way into high circles, and perhaps even capture the attention of the prince himself. After all, no one here knew the truth of their lives in Lamba. And Remy, with her practiced smile and soft hands, was ready to rewrite her story. But as the festival unfurled into full bloom, another figure prepared for the journey. Ebony stood at the edge of the baobab tree, her palm pressed against its gnarled bark. She hadn't planned to attend. The idea of royal gatherings and shining palaces felt as distant to her as the moon. But the village elder, an old woman named Mama F, who remembered Ebony's mother and knew the truth behind her silence, had insisted. "The river doesn't ask who you are before it carries your reflection," Mama F had said. "You don't need silk to walk among kings." And so Ebony dressed in a plain white wrapper, the color of morning light and new beginnings. Around her wrist she tied a single blue thread, the last remnant of her torn dress, once stained with blood, now faded to the color of memory. She carried no perfume, no jewels. Only her presence and the quiet power that had always lived in her bones. When she arrived at the city gates, no one looked twice. She slipped through crowds unnoticed, past dancers and drummers, past fruit sellers and masked performers. The festival was chaos and color, a whirlwind of celebration. But Ebony walked steadily, her senses tuned to the rhythm beneath the noise, the tremble of the earth, the murmur of roots, the distant hum that had always guided her. In the palace courtyard, the grandest part of the celebration was beginning. Nobles filled the marble steps, fanning themselves with peacock feathers. The queen stood tall in robes of silver, while Prince Jaru sat beside her, draped in ceremonial armor and crowned with woven gold leaves. He looked older now, sharper, quieter. His eyes scanned the crowd, and though he wore a public smile, something in his gaze was searching. Remy saw him and almost forgot to breathe. She tugged at her gown, adjusted her beads, and stepped forward, her mother trailing behind. They moved through the crowd like dancers, graceful and poised, rehearsed in charm. When they reached the front, they curtsied low, and Remy lifted her eyes to meet the prince's. But Jaru didn't see her. His attention had shifted. Across the courtyard, near the fountain carved from moonstone, stood a girl in white. No jewels, no gold. Just a single blue thread around her wrist. She wasn't pushing forward or calling out. She stood still, letting the world move around her like water around a stone. And Jaru's heart stilled. Without a word, he rose from his seat. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The queen turned, startled. Nobles whispered behind jeweled fans. But Jaru walked past them all, down the marble steps, through the crowd, until he stood before Ebony. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "You came," he said softly. She smiled. The earth whispered it was time. He reached for her hand, saw the thread around her wrist, and gently touched it. The memory of her dress, the days in the forest, the silence they shared, it all surged between them like wind through the trees. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. Remy stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. Her mother gripped her arm, whispering sharp curses. But it was too late. The prince had made his choice, not with a grand announcement, but with quiet certainty. He turned back to the crowd and lifted Ebony's hand. "This girl," he said, "is not a noble by blood. But nobility lives in her spirit. When I was broken and hunted, she healed me. When I had no name, she gave me kindness. If this festival is for peace, then let it also be for truth. The courtyard fell silent. Then someone clapped, an elder, then a child, then more. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then strong. The queen nodded, pride glimmering in her eyes. Remy's silk suddenly felt heavy. Her beads clinked like shackles. She turned away, her face burning. And Ebony, still wearing only a white wrapper and a blue thread, stood beside the prince, not as a savior, not as a queen, but as herself. And it was more than enough. The great courtyard of the royal palace was alive with music and color. Bright silks swayed like petals in the breeze, nobles laughed behind jeweled fans, and drums echoed like distant thunder. At the heart of the festivities stood Prince Jaru, regal in gold, though his eyes searched the crowd with a quiet yearning. Months had passed since his return, and peace had been declared across the borders. But the ache that lingered wasn't from battle, it was from the memory of a girl with gentle hands and a healing voice. As the festival reached its peak, trumpets sounded and silence fell across the crowd. The queen stood and addressed the gathering with grace. To mark the end of war, and to honor those who kept hope alive during our darkest days, my son, Prince Jaru, will offer a declaration. All eyes turned as the prince stepped forward. His voice was calm, but it carried deep purpose. During the war I was wounded and lost. My life was saved not by a soldier or a noble, but by a stranger with no title, someone with nothing to offer but kindness, wisdom, and cloth torn from what little she owned. He reached into his robe and lifted a small square of soft blue fabric. Though weathered, it seemed to shimmer faintly in the sunlight, like it held a secret only it could whisper. This cloth was wrapped around my wound, Jaru said, and something in it carried life. I made a vow, whoever its touch responds to, she will be the one I honor. She will be the one I marry. The court murmured. Confused whispers rippled through the noble families. It was unheard of, a prince choosing a bride this way? Jaru raised his hand and silence returned. The cloth remembers. Let it decide. One by one the women of court lined up. Jewels glittered, perfumes danced in the air, silks whispered as hands were laid gently on the cloth. But the fabric remained still, lifeless. Even when Remy approached, adorned in golden bangles and her most expensive robe, the cloth was unmoved. She forced a smile, touching it with feigned gentleness, then frowned when nothing happened. It must be broken, she muttered, but Jaru shook his head. He waited, patient. Then at the edge of the hall, someone hesitated. Ebony stepped forward. She wore no jewels, only a plain white wrapper tied at the waist. Around her wrist was a single thread of soft blue, the same shade as the cloth in Jaru's hands. The crowd turned. Some scoffed. A few whispered, recognizing her as the girl who had vanished from Lamba. But she walked steadily, her feet bare on the marble, her head high. Jaru watched her approach and his heart pounded. She reached the cloth. For a moment there was only stillness. Then, the moment her fingers touched it, the fragment quivered. A soft blue glow spread across its surface, as if it had found a missing part of itself. A warm wind stirred through the hall, rustling curtains and fluttering flames in the lanterns. The musicians paused, stunned. Noble stepped back, gasping. Jaru stepped forward, eyes locked on hers. It's you, he whispered, though he had always known. Ebony tried to speak, but emotion caught her breath. The cloth in her hand pulsed gently, warm like a living heart. Around them the murmurs grew louder. The queen stepped down from her seat, her eyes filled with wonder. This girl saved you? She asked. She did more than save me, Jaru said. She reminded me who I was before I was a prince. She taught me to listen to the earth, to stories, to the wind. And she gave up the only thing she had left of her mother to keep me alive. The queen looked at Ebony, then nodded slowly. Then she is worthy. More than worthy. But Remy was not silent. She stepped forward, red with fury. She's no noble. She's a servant, a liar. She ran off into the woods. How do we know she didn't trap the prince with forest magic? The cloth, still glowing in Ebony's hand, flared briefly as if in defiance. Jaru turned to Remy. You lied about her. You cast her aside. And yet, she is the one who healed a wounded stranger without knowing he was royalty. Tell me, Remy, if you had found me in the forest, would you have helped me? Remy's lips parted, but no answer came. The crowd turned away from her, their eyes now drawn to the quiet girl with the glowing cloth. Jaru took Ebony's hand. I made a vow, he said, and I will not break it. If you'll have me, Ebony, I ask not as a prince, but as a man you once saved in silence, will you walk beside me? Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. And as the crowd erupted in cheers, as the cloth dimmed and folded gently into her fingers, Ebony knew that the blue dress her mother once gave her had not been lost. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to find its power again. The hall falls into silence as Prince Jaru, standing beside Ebony, faces the crowd. His voice, calm but firm, demands answers. He asks who Ebony truly is and what life she lived before the festival. Ebony bows her head, saying nothing. Her silence is not weakness. It is dignity, the kind born from years of survival. Queen Namina, sharp-eyed and wise, rises from her seat. She calls for an inquiry. "Let the people of Lamba speak," she says. "Let truth rise where silence has long buried it." One by one, the villagers from Lamba step forward. First, it's old Mama Ire, who once tried to give Ebony a yam in secret and was chased off by Remy. Then comes young Kobe, who recalls seeing Ebony sweeping in the rain while her stepmother and stepsister laughed from the porch. Each voice stitches a story, a quilt of injustice too detailed to ignore. The stepmother shifts in her silks, her smile cracking. Remy grows pale, her hands wringing nervously. They try to interrupt. "Lies. All of it." Remy cries. "They envy us." But then the village elder steps forward, the same elder who once watched Ebony bury the torn dress under the baobab tree. With calm authority, he tells of the day Ebony was left with no food, of the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, of how she always helped others despite having nothing. The queen listens in silence. When all is said, she turns to Ebony and gently asks, "Is this true, child?" Ebony nods once. The queen does not shout. She does not rage. Instead, she declares judgment in a voice that echoes off marble pillars. "Stepmother and Remy, you are not fit for noble status," she says. "You will not be imprisoned. You will not be exiled. Instead, you will serve those you scorned. From this day forth, you will work in the royal kitchens, under the hand of those you believed beneath you." Gasps ripple through the crowd. The stepmother tries to protest, but, "I am of noble blood." The queen replies, "And yet you lacked a noble heart." The guards step forward. Remy begins to cry, not out of regret but shame. The stepmother glares at Ebony, but Ebony simply looks away, choosing not to meet hate with hate. As they are led away, the queen turns to Ebony. "You were born into dust but rose like flame," she says. "You carry no crown, yet you've shown more royalty than many born into it." And Ebony, quiet and steady, simply bows, not as a servant, but as one who has finally been seen. The palace bells rang at dawn, not for war or warning but for joy. The entire kingdom gathered to witness the union of Prince Jaru and Ebony. But it was no ordinary royal wedding. There were no parades of gold, no fire breathers tossing sparks into the sky. What made the day extraordinary was the woman walking beside the prince. A girl once treated like ash, now standing as flame beside the heir to the throne. Ebony did not wear diamonds on her head or jewels on her arms. Instead, she wore a dress stitched with meaning, history, and heart. The cloth that once saved Prince Jaru's life, torn and tossed in the forest, had been restored by the royal seamstresses, but Ebony insisted that every original thread be preserved, including the faded ones. She wanted the past to remain visible. The tears, the burns, the uneven patterns, they were all still there, woven into a new design that told a deeper truth. Beauty lives in what endures. When she stepped into the courtyard, a hush fell. Her dress shimmered softly in the morning sun, not with enchantment but with a story known by all. People wept, not out of sadness, but because they saw in her the proof that even a girl born in the shadows could become the light that guided a kingdom. The ceremony itself was simple. Jaru spoke first, not as a prince giving a speech, but as a man whose life had been remade. "I once rode through the forest seeking escape from royal burdens," he said. "And I found it not in power but in the courage of a girl who did not know my name. She gave me warmth when she had none to spare. She gave me silence when I needed peace. Today I marry not a servant, but the one who served truth when no one else dared." Ebony didn't speak in poetic flourishes. Her words were few but strong. "I am not here because I was chosen," she said. "I am here because I kept walking when the road turned dark." The queen placed a circlet of woven silver on her head, not a heavy crown but something light, crafted to resemble the cloth that had wrapped the prince. "Let this not be a symbol of rule," she said. "Let it be a reminder, soft hands once turned away thunder." After the wedding, the palace held a feast unlike any before. And when the sun fell, Prince Jaru led the people into the royal museum. There, behind a glass case, stood the famous dress. Not the wedding dress but the original torn piece. Still stained at the edges, still carrying the scent of earth and rain. It glowed faintly under lamplight and beside it, A single plaque read, "This cloth once saved a prince, not through magic but mercy." But Ebony's story did not end with her wedding. In fact, she treated that day as a beginning. Within weeks she began visiting the outer villages, not as royalty but as Ebony, the girl who once swept floors and fed chickens. She sat on mats with women and girls asking them what they needed. Over and over one answer came back: education. Girls were being left behind, their minds caged by tradition and fear. So, Ebony opened the first school in Lamba, her village. It wasn't grand. The desks were carved by local hands and the chalkboards were donated. But when the doors opened, over 100 girls walked in, some barefoot, some wide-eyed, all ready to learn. She did not teach them only letters and numbers. She taught them how to speak truth even when it trembled on their tongues. How to listen. How to question. How to dream. From Lamba, the movement spread like fire over dry grass. By the end of the year, 10 more schools had opened. Ebony traveled constantly, sometimes with the prince, sometimes alone, always with the same message: you are not too small to change the world. And when girls asked her, "But what if they don't listen?" she would smile and say, "Then you speak anyway. The world does not change by waiting, it changes by walking." Back in the palace, the queen began a new tradition. Every year, during the Festival of Light, children would gather in the lantern-lit halls and sit at her feet. She would hold the torn cloth in her lap, her fingers gently tracing the frayed edge, and begin the tale. There was once a girl named Ebony who lived in a house where love was rationed like scraps. The children listened with wide eyes, sometimes laughing at young Kobe's mischief, sometimes crying when Ebony ate alone in the dark. But always they cheered when the cloth glowed in the prince's hand. Some of them would later ask, "Is it true?" And the queen would say, "Yes. True enough to change a kingdom." Years passed. Ebony never called herself queen. She preferred first teacher. Her chambers were lined with books, letters from students, and gifts from grateful mothers. The palace halls that once echoed with politics now rang with children's questions. Remy and the stepmother remained in the palace, serving in the kitchens. Time wore down their arrogance. At first they mumbled curses. Then silence. Then quiet regret. One day Remy came to Ebony, head bowed, hands flour dusted. "I once laughed when you ate from the floor," she said. "Now I serve others and understand. I don't ask forgiveness, I only offer change." Ebony didn't speak, but she nodded. That was enough. As decades passed, the dress remained in the glass case, never touched, never moved. It aged, its colors fading, but it remained the most visited artifact in the kingdom. People came from distant lands not to see gold or thrones, but a piece of cloth that had once touched kindness and sparked a revolution. One winter, long after her hair had turned to silver, Ebony stood alone before the case. She touched the glass and whispered, "You were torn like I was, but you held." Behind her, children ran through the palace, shouting questions about stars, dragons, and history. And she smiled, not for herself but for what had been built. The kingdom was no longer ruled by fear, tradition, or name. It was ruled by thought, story, and compassion. And it all began with a torn dress, and the girl who refused to be forgotten.